Reed Salter didn't grow up with a lawyer on speed dial. He didn't need one. His life had always been about land, not litigation. He was the third generation to walk that same patch of Texas dirt. His grandfather, Henry Salter, had bought the original 180 acres in 1946 with the last of his war pay and a handshake. No corporate financing. No zoning disputes. Just barbed wire, sweat, and a vision of soil that would feed cattle and raise sons. Reed was a quiet man. 57, unmarried, steady as sunrise. The kind of man who could fix a well pump in the dark or tell if a fence was weak just by the way it groaned in the wind. His house sat low and strong on a hill near the northern edge of the property, the same slab his grandfather poured by hand. The wind always came from the south in the morning, sweeping through the bluestem like a ghost with memory. Clearview Hills sat just beyond his eastern boundary. A new subdivision, modern but too clean, a sprawl of engineered lawns and identical houses. Reed hadn't given it much thought until the houses started getting closer. Closer to his land. Closer to his fences. And then came the letters .at first. It was little stuff. Vague notes from the HOA, reminding neighbors of upcoming adjustments to local parcels for community integration. Reed got one in the mail with his address typed across the top, even though he had never opted in, never paid dues, never signed a damn thing with them. The envelope was smooth, the language too polite. But underneath it, he felt the pressure. The same kind of pressure his father had warned him about. It's never about the gate, son. It's about getting you to move the post. Then Karen Harper showed up. She didn't knock. She stood just on the other side of his property line, with a man in a navy blue sport coat and a stack of papers. She smiled like she rehearsed it. Mr. Salter, she said, I'm here to discuss a mutually beneficial opportunity. Reed stepped off the porch with a clipboard of his own. Not paper, just a list of fence repairs. He listened. Karen explained she was president of the Clearview Hills HOA. Said they were planning a green corridor for community use. A walking trail. A dog park. Maybe even a nature education center. She gestured toward the lower pasture like it was already hers. We're hoping to integrate your land into this project. Reed didn't say anything. The man with her handed over documents. Reed flipped through. His name was on them. His address. His property parcel number. And on page 3, a signed consent form. A signature. His signature. Except it wasn't. He looked up at Karen. This forgery is bad enough to insult a mule's intelligence. He said. Karen's eyes narrowed for just a second before her smile returned. That's unfortunate. There must have been a clerical error. But let's not let a little mix-up get in the way of progress. Reed walked back inside. No yelling. No threats. He just shut the door. Then he called Sheriff Hank Hale. Hank had known the Salter family for decades. He wasn't fast-talking, but he didn't like being lied to. Reed showed him the forged documents. He showed him the deed, the original, signed by his grandfather and notarized in ink so old it faded like a shadow. He showed him camera footage too, of Karen and her cousin walking up with those same papers. Karen and Brad were detained that afternoon. It could have stopped there. Maybe should have. But some people, when caught, get quieter. Karen Harper got louder. Within days, Reed started receiving emails, county notices about his zoning, noise complaints, anonymous tips about unsightly storage structures. Animal control showed up twice, asking if his cattle were registered as livestock or pets. It escalated fast. Then came the machinery point. One morning before dawn, Reed heard engines. Not trucks. Not tractors. He stood on his porch and saw them. 2 bulldozers parked just outside the fence. Karen was there in a windbreaker, clipboard in hand, pointing toward the pasture. When he stepped onto his land, she didn't flinch. This section has been provisionally reassigned for public utility expansion under our HOA's partnership with the Development Office, she said. You're trespassing. Reed replied. Her cousin Brad, standing beside the bulldozers, smiled like he knew something Reed didn't. But what Reed knew was this. He had documented everything. He picked up his phone. Called Hank again. Then called Joanne Grayson. Joanne didn't do country cases often. She was a city attorney with a reputation for handling land disputes like a demolition crew, methodical, relentless, and final. She took one look at the file Reed had compiled, every letter, every forged map, every timestamp photo, and said, You've done half my work for me. They filed a motion for an emergency injunction before noon. By sunset, Karen and Brad were in the back of a patrol cruiser, and Reed's fence stood exactly where it had the day before. Reed had never sat in a courtroom before, at least not as a plaintiff. The walls felt too polished, the chairs too stiff. But when he looked across the aisle and saw Karen Harper whispering to her defense attorney like she was still the one in control, he didn't feel nervous. He felt ready. It wasn't just that he had the original deed in a laminated binder, or that Joanne Grayson was sitting next to him with a color-coded folder thicker than the county tax records. It was something deeper. Like the land itself had settled under his feet and said, This is yours. Prove it one more time. Joanne opened with a statement that was part scalpel, part sledgehammer. Your Honor, what we are dealing with is not a property dispute. This is organized fraud, carried out by a person who exploited the illusion of authority for personal gain. Mr. Salter's land was targeted not by accident, but by calculation. The judge nodded, but said nothing. What followed was 3 days of testimony, evidence presentation, and quiet but thorough dissection of Karen's paper trail. Joanne had it all. Not just the forged documents, but the metadata. The falsified dates. The so-called easement requests that didn't match county records. Even internal Clearview Hills HOA memos referring to Reed's property as Phase 2 Greenway integration. And then, there was the footage. Security camera video showed Karen and Brad entering the property perimeter 3 separate times, uninvited. They weren't inspecting. They were planning. In one clip, Brad is heard telling a contractor, He's a single old-timer. He'll fold when the bulldozers show up. Reed watched the jury's expressions carefully as that played. Some leaned forward. Others looked toward him with a different kind of understanding now, not just legal sympathy, but personal recognition. They saw what he was standing for. Karen took the stand. Her testimony was confident. At first, she blamed clerical errors, called it drone flights, a community safety measure, denied ever referring to Salter's land as annexable. Joanne waited until day 2 to drop the real hammer. HOA financial records. Her team had subpoenaed Clearview Hill's internal ledgers and uncovered a web of misappropriated funds, dues redirected to a community development escrow that had been quietly funding the very bulldozers that rolled towards Salter's fence. And Brad? Listed as a consultant. Paid under a fictitious company that hadn't filed taxes in 5 years. The judge's eyebrows rose. Karen's face fell. When Brad was called to testify, he tried to plead the fifth. But under pressure, and facing his own separate fraud charge, he cracked. His confession wasn't dramatic. Just pitiful. She thought we'd get away with it. She said old-timers like Salter wouldn't fight. That they'd be too scared of court costs. Joanne stepped forward. And were you scared, Mr. Harper? Brad didn't answer, but Reed did. He turned to the court and said, they weren't expecting someone who knew every fence post by name. Underscore 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 underscore. The verdict came quicker than expected. Karen Harper was found guilty of property fraud, conspiracy, criminal trespass, falsification of legal documents, and misappropriation of HOA funds. Brad received a lighter sentence as part of his plea deal. Both were ordered to pay restitution, with Karen facing a minimum of 4 years in state prison and a civil judgment that would follow her for the rest of her life. The HOA? Dissolved. The county ordered a complete audit. Within 3 months, Clearview Hills reformed as an opt-in neighborhood advisory board with no legal authority over non-members. Their new charter began with a statement Reed quietly suggested. No structure shall claim land not rightfully bound to it. Joanne didn't stay long after the case ended. She left Reed with every file and a handshake. You taught me more than I taught you, she said. Reed smiled, nodded, and tucked the last folder into his desk drawer. There was no parade. No local news crew. Just Reed, walking his land again the next morning as the fog lifted from the pasture. Same boots. Same wind. Same soil. But something had changed. He no longer walked like he was guarding something fragile. He walked like he'd built something solid. Reed Salter never wanted to be a name on paper. He wanted to be the kind of man who left behind calluses, not headlines. But after the trial ended, and the dust settled over Clearview Hills, there were people in counties he'd never visited who knew who he was. He didn't speak to reporters. When the Austin Tribune requested an interview, he sent back the original court ruling with 3 words underlined: deed, fraud, restitution. He didn't need to explain anything else. His days returned to the pattern he'd fought for. Sun up before the wind crested the hill. Coffee black, boots dusted from the porch, hat brim curled slightly from years of sweat. His cows still needed tending. His fence still needed walking. And the pasture, like always, told him more than any court document ever could, but he noticed the difference in the silence. Before the trial, silence had carried weight, a hush you listened through, waiting for a truck engine or the thrum of drone rotors. Now, silence meant rest. It meant no threats. It meant he'd held. He didn't win a war. He preserved a peace. That, in the end, was the greater act. Underscore 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 underscore. People began stopping by, not to take from him, but to learn. It wasn't just ranchers. It was widows with inheritance land. It was young couples buying their first unzoned acre. It was veterans returning to rural life, wary of legal language and title confusion. They came with questions. Reed gave them copies of forms, showed them where to find their parcel history, how to request zoning status in writing, not over the phone. He didn't charge. He didn't preach. He just told the truth. You can't stop a liar from lying, he said. But you can sure make them regret picking you. One man came from out of state, Arkansas plates, former oilfield worker turned farmer. He was battling a development group claiming an old logging road as an implied public easement. Reed showed him how to trace his plat back 3 owners. How to compare the GIS map against old field notes from a 1974 timber contract. How to issue a certified letter challenging the claim and demanding legal documentation. You bury them in their own paperwork, Reed said. And when they come up for air, you have the truth already printed. The man left with a flash drive full of scanned documents. 3 months later, he wrote back. They folded. The road was never theirs. I'd have lost it without your system. Reed didn't reply. He didn't need thanks, but he kept the letter. Underscore 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 underscore. When Clearview Hills formally restructured, they invited Reed to sit on the advisory board. He declined. I already have land to manage, he said. That's more than enough. But he donated a binder. Not the original case file, just a copy. Inside was a single-page forward. Community starts when you stop trying to control what isn't yours. That sentence became the board's mission statement. Years later, a city planning committee in Waco quoted it in their public charter on suburban boundary agreements. Reed never found out, but his name was there, footnoted and italicized. R. Salter, 2031. Then came the storm, not legal. A real one. A spring squall from the Gulf turned hard and fast, and by the time it hit his land, the wind was tearing shingles and snapping cedar limbs. Reed wrote it out in the barn office, watching the flood creep toward the fence line. When it was over, 24 trees were down. His creek overflowed into the north pasture. His east fence line, the one closest to Clearview Hills, was flattened in 3 places. The next morning, he stepped out expecting to start repairs alone, but there were already people at the gate. 4 neighbors. None he'd spoken to since the trial. 2 brought posts. 1 had a digger. 1 just carried coffee. "We owe you," they said. Reed looked at the damage. Looked at them. Then pointed toward the corner post. "That one first. It holds the line." They rebuilt the fence in silence. No speeches. No selfies. Just work. That evening, the neighbor who brought coffee stayed a few minutes longer. He looked out at the new fence line. "Feels different now," he said. "Feels right." Reed nodded. "That's what a boundary is supposed to do." The flood had pulled more than fence posts from the soil. It had stirred something else, recognition. Neighbors who once signed Karen Harper's petitions now nodded when they saw Reed at the feed store. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Their silence was no longer passive. It was respectful. Reed didn't forgive easily. He wasn't built for that. But he wasn't bitter either. His way of moving on was practical. If someone showed up with a tool belt instead of an excuse, he handed them a hammer. That was forgiveness enough. Months passed. The new fence held through 2 more storms. The pasture came back slow but steady. Calves were born without fear of loud machinery or trespassing surveyors. Reed planted 2 pecans by the barn, 1 for his father, 1 for his grandfather. He never said their names aloud, but when he passed the trees, he tipped his hat. He also started something new, not a program, not a foundation, just a habit. Every Saturday morning, he opened the barn office, set out 2 chairs, poured coffee, and waited. Sometimes no one came. Sometimes 3 people showed up with plat maps and scared eyes. He never promised to fix anything. He only promised to help them understand what was theirs. 1 teenager arrived with his mother. They owned 6 acres near a dry creek that a developer was now calling emergency drainage access. They said we had no choice, she told Reed. That it was just how zoning worked. Reed laid out her deed next to the floodplain overlay. Showed her how her lot had never been included in any municipal runoff agreement. Explained the difference between right-of-way and easement. Then he handed her a letter template. "Don't ask permission," he said. "State your boundary. Let them argue against the truth." They left with a plan. A month later, she sent a photo of a county letter. "Request withdrawn, ownership verified." Reed posted it on the corkboard in the barn under a handwritten title. Another line held. That board filled slowly. 10, then 20, then 50 pin notes from all over Texas. Small wins. Quiet defenses. Families who kept their tree line. Ranchers who stopped illegal encroachments. No names needed. Just proof. He called it his field fence. Underscore 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 underscore. One fall evening, as the sky turned the color of rusted iron, Reed sat on the porch and opened the thickest binder he owned, the original. The one with every scrap from the Karen Harper battle. The forged documents. The sheriff's incident reports. The subpoenas. Joanne Grayson's closing arguments. His grandfather's deed. He added one final page. It wasn't legal. It wasn't official. It was a letter. To whoever owns this land next. If they come for it again, don't panic. They will sound confident. They'll have titles, signatures, maybe even support from people who smile while they're lying. Ignore the noise. Go to the box, pull the truth, then walk the fence line. Every inch. You'll feel it. What they can't steal is what we've already given it. Our names, our hands, our time. That's what makes it yours. He slid the letter into a folder labeled for the next owner. Then he locked it in the same steel cabinet that had once stored rusted wire and spare bolts. Not because he expected anyone to steal the land again, but because the next person might not be him. Reed Salter never made a speech. Not at the trial. Not at the community meetings. Not when Clearview Hills dissolved its HOA, or when people started calling his binder a land rights manual. He didn't care for titles or attention. He didn't even call what happened to him injustice. He called it interference. And all his life, Reed had one rule about interference. Stop it before it spreads. The last few years of his life weren't marked by awards or tributes. They were marked by routine. Fences walked, wells checked, pasture mowed slow and even. The pecan trees he planted by the barn began to grow thick at the base. He kept a journal, written in longhand, only ever about the land. North Gate hinge still holding, 50 years this month, deer tracks along east fence. Must be $2 by the size. Storm coming Saturday. Locked down feed sheds Friday afternoon. He never wrote about Karen Harper again. Not once. She was a chapter already closed, filed, and stored in a box he no longer opened. But her shadow had done something unexpected. It had sharpened everything else. Reed taught 3 local teenagers how to read a plat map. Taught a widow how to navigate the county clerk's land registry portal. Helped a young couple file their first title insurance dispute when a utility tried to bury a line through their yard. All of it without asking for anything. He didn't want to be remembered. He wanted his methods to be remembered. Underscore 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 underscore. By the time Reed turned 78, arthritis had taken most of the strength from his left hand. But he still rode his 4-wheeler along the perimeter twice a week. Still checked the posts. Still carried the same old laminated map in his vest pocket, edges worn soft like river stones. One morning, in the cold months of March, he didn't come in for breakfast. The neighbor who brought eggs by once a week saw the barn light still on at dusk. Walked in. Found him sitting in the old chair by the cabinet, journal on his lap, hat still on his head, hands folded. Peaceful. Still. Just like a man who had nothing left to defend. He was buried on the ridge, just west of the south fence line, the very place Karen Harper once tried to call hers. There was no funeral. He'd written that into his will. No black ties, no speeches, no nonsense. Instead, a few neighbors gathered, hammered in a cedar post at the corner of his plot, and carved into it, "Read SLTR." He walked the line. His ashes were mixed with the roots of the taller pecan. 2 weeks later, it sprouted a new branch. Underscore 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 underscore. Today, the Salter Ranch is preserved under a community land trust, not owned by any one person, but protected by those Reed taught. The boundary markers are still in place, freshly painted every spring. The barn office remains open every Saturday morning. Locals come in with thumb drives and questions. They leave with answers and maps. The binder, his original, worn and smudged, is still there. So is the letter he wrote. If they come for it again, they haven't come again, and maybe they won't, because enough people now know what Reed knew all along, that the only thing more powerful than ownership is remembrance, and that the most sacred thing a person can defend isn't just land, but the right to say, "This is mine, because I have stood for it."